Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 251, 3 verses hundreds, Part 3. The small silhouette was very agile, its movements were fluid as water sliding in the middle of the rocks, and it seemed that any obstruction could not stop it. With just a small jump and a few grabs, the silhouette reached the second-floor window of the building and looked through the opening. All that could be seen from the outside was darkness, and anyone would have trouble telling what the situation was like inside. However, the pupils of the small silhouette that had its entire face covered suddenly took on a strange pale green glow, and the darkness seemed to disappear before its eyes, revealing the interior of the room. However, the first thing the little silhouette saw made its pupils shrink to the maximum extent possible. Because just 6 meters in front of it, a young man rested standing against the opposite wall and looked in its direction with a smile that was not a smile. The small silhouette reacted immediately like an experienced assassin. While using the wall as an impulse to jump backward and just before gravity pulled it back to the ground, it threw several sharp objects that flew at full speed in the direction of the young man. Forehead, eyes, throat, heart, abdomen, the sharp objects aimed with terrifying precision at vital areas of the body, and considering the speed at which they flew due to the strength with which they were thrown, even a soul evolver could lose their life in this kind of deadly situation. Xietain narrowed his eyes and immediately noticed that this person who was trying to assassinate him definitely had a lot of experience in this kind of situation. If it wasn't him or Shangguan Bing Shui, anyone else in his group would most probably die in the face of such a ruthless and precise attack. Unfortunately, this fatal assassin met him. Swoosh. 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 His right hand moved at thunderous speeds, and 4 residual images appeared for a moment before disappearing. Just before its balaclava-covered head went too low and it lost sight of the situation inside the room, the assassin felt its heart stop for a split second as it saw its attack stopped by the mysterious young man with bare hands. Those sharp objects that the small silhouette had thrown were parts of a level 20 mutated porcupine. With the assassin's strength matching the piercing ability of the thorns, even a war tank would be pierced through, but the young man caught it so easily. When the toe of the assassin's left foot came into contact with the courtyard floor once again, it did not even hesitate and dashed into the distance at full speed. In the past, even before the apocalypse, the small silhouette had worked as an assassin and had a lot of experience in this field. Now that it had evolved and acquired various skills befitting its profession, its killing power had increased to frightening levels. However, the killer instinct deep inside the small silhouette told it that the mysterious young man was too difficult a target to deal with. You want to come and then leave at will? Better stay and chat for a while. A voice filled with disdain reached the assassin's ears. The assassin's pupils suddenly shuddered as a bad premonition overtook it. Without delay, it twisted its body in a strange angle as if its body was made of rubber while keeping its speed up to the maximum possible. Swoosh. 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 The wind swooshed softly as if several objects at high speed were piercing it. These objects were the 4 thorns that the assassin had used before. Thanks to its experience and ability, the small silhouette managed to evade 3 of the thorns. However, the 4th and last one was moving too fast, so it barely managed to move its body a little to the left before it was pierced. Ugh. A low groan sounded in the middle of the dark night. An arrow of blood flew out from the assassin's shoulder after being pierced by the sharp and lethal thorn that entered through its back and exited through the front of its body. Such ability and such dreadful strength. The assassin was frightened. The other side was not only a powerful soul evolver, but also had a lot of experience with throwing weapons. Could it be that he was also an experienced assassin? Xietain chased after the assassin and was also a bit surprised. With his skill Special Forces soldier, he was very skilled with all kinds of weapons. Throwing weapons was one of them, even more, thanks to the skill throwing. Little did he expect that the assassin would actually manage to dodge his previous attack. Of course, if he wanted his enemy dead, he could have ended this fight much earlier. But unlike today's 12 gang members, this assassin would definitely have more useful information for him and his group. After all, having information was crucial, considering that they were currently in enemy territory. Xietain extended his hand forward and the earth bracelet momentarily shimmered. In the next instant, a magic circle glowed right in front of the assassin, and the next moment a large spike of magic earth shot up from the ground. The assassin was really capable, and the first instant the magic circle appeared it knew that its life was in danger. The worst thing was that if it jumped back to evade the magical attack, the assassin would run into the young man that was in pursuit and would quickly catch up. With no other options, no time to think too much, and with supernatural agility, the small silhouette jumped and turned its body in the air in such a way that its head was pointing towards the ground and its legs towards the sky. Just when Xietain thought that the opponent was going to commit suicide and the earth spike was millimeters away from piercing its head, the small silhouette pulled out a dagger from its waist and used the tip of the dagger to support the weight of its body on the tip of the magic earth spike. Making use of the momentum of the magic spike, the small silhouette leaped high into the sky and prepared to make use of its knowledge of the terrain to increase the distance between itself and the young man. It was only thanks to its knowledge of the base and the various alleyways that it had not yet been caught. Unfortunately, the instant the assassin jumped to avoid the magic earth spike and its feet left the ground, its fate had been sealed. Swoosh! The wind swooshed lightly once more, and as the small silhouette swooshed through the air, it saw out of the corner of its eye some sort of string flying in its direction. Just as it was about to use its dagger to cut the string, it suddenly realized that it could not move the shoulder that had been pierced earlier by the porcupine's thorn. The assassin did not understand what was happening, as it could feel the blood in that area of its body limiting as much as possible the movements it could make normally. In that brief instant of shock, the string stuck to its chest and, to the assassin's horror, when it tried to cut the string with the other hand, it was once again shocked to realize that in reality, it was spider silk, and extremely strong. Even its dagger could not cut through. Xietain inwardly scoffed as he saw the assassin's futile efforts. If the silk of the arachnid silk ring, a magic-grade treasure, was so weak and easy to cut, then it would be the shame of all magic-grade treasures. After limiting the assassin's movements, Xietain forcefully pulled the silk back. The small silhouette, which was still in full flight, suddenly changed its direction and flew towards him at full speed. But the assassin was really professional. Realizing that this time it really couldn't run away, it did not hesitate and stabbed with its dagger towards the young man's head with all its strength. This strike not only contained the assassin's strength, but also contained the movement speed of its body after being thrown backward. You really won't shed your tears unless the Reaper appears before you. Xietain coldly snorted. He stretched out his left hand and, under the stupefied gaze of the small silhouette, easily caught the dagger. One had to know that this dagger was no ordinary object, it was a strangely strong magic-grade treasure. Just when the assassin felt its mind go blank after so many shocks, Xietain caught the head of the small silhouette with his right hand. His palm covered a large part of the assassin's head as if he was an adult catching a small child. Xietain turned his body while clinging to the assassin's head, and after turning 180 degrees, he threw his body harshly backward. Swoosh! A strange multicolored barrier appeared in the air, and with a thud, the assassin's body hit the energy barrier. Cough! The small silhouette involuntarily coughed up fresh blood. Because Xietan's previous grip was too firm, the balaclava that healed its head completely no longer covered its face, therefore, the blood fell to the ground. The assassin also fell heavily to the ground and fainted on the spot. Slowly, the multicolored barrier disappeared, and the sound of slow footsteps could be heard amidst the darkness. Soon, the beautiful and graceful Xietain appeared. Despite wearing baggy clothes, the curves of her body were visible to the naked eye, especially the front area. You really have no mercy regardless of gender. Xietain chuckled softly as she looked at Xietain with an amused smile. After riding 48 hours in the same vehicle, the two of them had talked quite a bit, so the confidence between them had increased a bit. At least, now they could joke occasionally without any problems. Xietain did not know whether to laugh or cry when he heard Xietan's comment. He walked over to the assassin's immobile body and squatted down. This is something I didn't expect. Xietain sighed softly. Although he was a little surprised, his voice was quite cold, indicating that he did not mind seeing that. In fact, the assassin turned out to be a young woman. Xietain, with the help of Xietain, took all the weapons away from the fainting assassin. Then, he casually threw her over his shoulder after binding her limbs. A few seconds later, Bai Zemin and Nangong Lingxin had disappeared into the darkness of the night once again. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 252 3 verses Hundreds, Part 4. Inside the room designed to be the living room of the two-story building that was devoid of practically any furniture, Bai Zemin, Shangguan Bing Shui, Nangong Yi, and Nangong Lingxin were standing while looking at the unconscious person on the floor with her limbs restrained. The room was completely silent, the only exception being the cold wind coming through the broken windows of the building. While there was electricity in this particular building, the place did not even have a single light bulb. Therefore, to prevent being in the dark, Bai Zemin's group had no choice but to make a temporary fire using the wood from the kitchen counter. The group planned to move tonight in any case, so after capturing part of the base, they would no longer have to stay in this broken and rundown building. The fire in the bonfire was swaying to the rhythm of the wind blowing through the broken windows, and the illumination provided by the blaze was enough so that the appearance of the unconscious person on the ground could be seen by all present. How was the young lady's strength? Nangong Yi asked calmly. His voice amidst the silence was clear enough for everyone to hear, even though his tone of voice was quite low to avoid waking up the mother and daughter duo sleeping in the room above. Shangguan Bing Shui and Nangong Lingxin also looked at the one person who had confronted the assassin, waiting for his answer. Bai Zemin was silent for a moment before finally answering honestly. Her statistics didn't seem to be too surprising. Before the others could say anything, he continued, but her combat ability, her control over her body, the speed with which she could react, the choice of each move, and the elasticity with which she could move. Everything was top-notch. Except for Shangguan Bing Shui and me, not even Chen, he would be able to survive 5 trades with this girl, as her skill with throwing weapons is so terrifying that even I have to be careful with. The 3 of them were shocked at Bai Zemin's words. Especially Shangguan Bing Shui. She looked at him with clear surprise in her clear eyes and asked, "She is definitely already a first-order existence, so she must be one of the strongest soul evolvers within this base. But it only took about 10 seconds from the time you detected her presence to the time you captured her alive. Are you sure you're not exaggerating a bit?" Bai Zemin shook his head and replied in a clear voice, "No, I'm not exaggerating in the slightest. Sure, if I wanted her to die, I could have easily killed her in the blink of an eye. But capturing her alive was far from easy. In fact, if she hadn't shown any hesitation in her final attack, even I might have found myself with a little headache and definitely would have been injured." What? Nangong Lingxin couldn't help but raise her voice as she looked at Bai Zemin in a state of utter shock. To her, Bai Zemin was simply the very representation of the god of humanity, therefore, hearing his words came as a great shock to Nangong Lingxin. Forget Nangong Lingxin, the most shocked person present was undoubtedly Shangguan Bing Shui. As one of the people who had walked the same path of survival as Bai Zemin from the first day the world completely changed, she had watched him grow up step by step and knew that he was a horrendously strong person. However, the girl who was passed out due to the hit she received could have hurt him. If it was a second-order beast, then Shangguan Bing Shui would be able to accept it more easily. But even a group of a dozen first-order beasts could not injure him in the past. It should be even more impossible now that he had absorbed some of the second-order archaic bear soul power. Bai Zemin naturally felt Shangguan Bing Shui's look of disbelief and Nangong Lingxin's incredibly shocked gaze. He immediately understood their thoughts, so he smiled bitterly and instead of explaining, pulled out a dagger from his waist. "That's..." Shangguan Bing Shui looked at the dagger in confusion. The dagger was deep black with the engraving of a blood-red rose between the hilt and the edge of the blade. The shape of the blade was quite strange as it had several curves, and on the edge, one could see what appeared to be the vines and thorns of a rose. This dagger is a magic-grade treasure. It's the assassin's weapon." Bai Zemin sighed and handed the weapon to Shangguan Bing Shui. "Look at that dagger and you will understand what I mean." Shangguan Bing Shui frowned slightly and looked at the dagger in her hand. She wished to know the weapon's information, and soon the messages began to flash in her retina. Death's Kiss, magic-grade treasure, when equipped automatically increases the wearer's agility by 50 points and strength by 30 points. Crafted from orchid bacillate from the Zolian world. Extremely lethal and capable of piercing any armored vehicle on pre-apocalyptic Earth as well as any defensive object of rank 2 and below. Once per day, you can activate the unique skill Death's Kiss, increasing your critical hit probability by 50% during your next attack and poisoning the enemy with a paralyzing effect for 1 second. After reading the information about the dagger in her hands, the coldness and indifference on Shangguan Bingshue's face disappeared completely. This greatly surprised Nangong Yi and Nangong Lingxin, as this was the first time they had seen Shangguan Bingshue show such a level of shock. As if she was in some sort of trance, she passed the dagger to Nangong Lingxin, who 5 seconds later had exactly the same reaction. Dying of curiosity, Nangong Yi did not wait for her younger sister to hand over the weapon and instead grabbed it out of her hands as if he were an anxious little child instead of a 40-year-old adult. Nangong Yi, unlike the two women, sucked in a breath of cold air and unconsciously muttered, "Zolian world. Another world." Although when the soul record appeared for the first time on Earth, everyone present already had their suspicions about the existence of other, more evolved worlds, this dagger, called Death's Kiss, confirmed it completely. This was different from scientific theories, this was total certainty. Moreover, the material from which Death's Kiss was crafted was a kind of metal so strong and powerful that even the soul record used it together with the remnant soul power of the fallen existence to shape this dagger. This also meant that, at the very least, that world was quite a bit more advanced than the current Earth. Shangguan Bingshue could not help but worry, the Earth. It won't be invaded by other worlds, right? For the first time since Bai Zemin met her, this woman who always stood her ground revealed an expression of anxiety, worry, and her always confident and arrogant voice now contained some incertitude. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 253, 3 verses hundreds, Part 5. Shangguan Bingshue's concerns about another world invading Earth were not unreasonable, and thus the slight break in her character was understandable. Until now, even if everyone had their own theories and thoughts, they had never thought of such a possibility. No, rather than saying that they had not thought about it, perhaps it would be more correct to say that they were simply unwilling to think about such an event. Earth was already facing too many problems to count: zombies, mutant beasts, goblins, and who knows if there were more fantasy species roaming around out there. Even humans themselves were not allies as a race, separating out of fear of each other and fear of seeing their personal property harmed. In Yanqing district alone, Bai Zemin's group had encountered many huge problems, and the life and death situations they had to deal with could not be counted as just one or two. Then, how dangerous would the rest of China be? And how about the rest of the world? The problems and dangers humanity faced were too many. But now there was a weapon created from a strange material from another world that no one had ever heard of. If a weapon could get here, then who could guarantee that the inhabitants of that world could not? Even if the weapon had been born thanks to the soul record using a material called orchid badgelate, no one could be sure what would happen in the future. At the very least, the possibility of being invaded was now present, and that alone was enough to make even Shangguan Bingshue fearful, not to mention the rest. Nangong Yi and Nangong Lingxin also turned slightly pale at the thought, and unconsciously or not, they all looked at Bai Zemin waiting for an answer. After all, for some reason, Bai Zemin always had an answer for everything. Bai Zemin sighed inwardly. After a moment's hesitation, he decided to tell the things he knew so far and his thoughts. Of course, he narrated everything as a possibility and as theories rather than certainties, since otherwise he would have no way to explain how he knew such things. Although I'm not really sure, temporarily we should be fine. Temporarily? What specifically do you mean? Nangong Lingxin hurriedly pursued. Bai Zemin was silent for a moment as if in thought before slowly saying, "This is just a theory, but I think it would be good to keep in mind. As we already know, humans and wild beasts are divided into orders, and within each order there are different levels. Unclassified from level 0 to level 25, first order from level 25 to level 50, and second order from level 50 to unknown. For now that's all we know, since while none of us have reached the first order limit, we have faced a second order beast in the past." Although Nangong Lingxin and Nangong Yi had not yet joined the group back then, both siblings already knew that Bai Zemin's group had faced a horrendously powerful beast, and that it had been that powerful beast who had managed to injure someone as strong as Bai Zemin before perishing. So, since we, living beings of this world, are constantly evolving and growing, why wouldn't the world do so as well? Xietain paused here and looked at everyone's reaction. As he expected, everyone was filled with disbelief. However, soon enough that disbelief turned to shock, realization, and they even seemed to have enlightened themselves about something. How did I not think of that before? Nangong Lingxin exclaimed, apparently forgetting about Yifeng and Xiangfeng, who were sleeping upstairs, or perhaps too engaged to worry about minor matters. Since we evolved, of course, the world must evolve as well. Indeed. Because if the world can't evolve. Nangong Yi paused. Shangguan Bingshui finished what he wanted to say. If the world cannot evolve or keep up with the rate of evolution of the beings that inhabit it, then it will one day end up facing its own destruction. That's right. Xietain nodded with an earnest expression. If the world does not evolve, then someday it will be destroyed. Look at what we can do being relatively low-level existences and barely first order or even unclassified. Then try to imagine how devastating the clash of two beings of higher orders such as third, fourth, even fifth order or more could be. Xietain could already make a small wasteland with an extension of 1 kilometer being only a first-order existence. So what could he do when he reached the fourth order? Just imagining it made everyone feel a chill. So, I think the world will definitely evolve. He concluded. I don't know when, and I don't know how, but it will definitely evolve. As for what happens in each evolution of the world, there is no way to guess. We can only try to predict to adapt as soon as possible to the changes. In the end, what they as humans could do was limited. Whether or not Earth was invaded by other worlds was not something they could decide or avoid. The best they could do was prepare for the worst possible events so that they would be able to, at the very least, not be caught with their pants down. Seeing everyone's worried faces, Xietain smiled slightly and said confidently, but don't worry. Who knows how long it will have to be before this new world faces its first major change. By the time comes, we will be far more powerful. We will survive, no matter what. Even if we have to wipe out myriads of enemies and races, we will definitely survive. Xietan's words managed to ease the heavy mood in the group a bit. As to whether his words were meant to calm them or him, only Xietain himself knew. Now that the matter of a possible invasion had been slightly put aside, Nangong Lingxin shook her head and decided to focus on another matter at hand. She looked at the strange dagger and asked in confusion, this dagger is undoubtedly a high-quality treasure. But there is something I don't understand. She paused and then looked at the fainted assassin. Why didn't that girl activate the dagger's skill? I clearly saw how Xietain caught the dagger with his bare hands. If she wanted to, she could have cut off his hand and could have even paralyzed him, which would give her 1 second to even attack him mortally. This was the doubt that everyone present had. As each of them picked up the dagger, they clearly felt that the skill Death's Kiss was still available to activate. So, why didn't the assassin activate this skill, since she probably knew that this would be her only option to run away? In fact, the reason why Xietain did not wake up this killer girl by beating or breaking some of her limbs was because at the last moment he saw the hesitation in the girl's eyes. Otherwise, he would definitely not wait for his enemy to wake up comfortably. Ugh. While everyone was immersed in their own inner thoughts, a small groan sounded amidst the crackling of the flames coming from the bonfire. The eyes of Xietain and the others immediately focused on the silhouette lying on the floor. The person who had sneaked into the building and attempted to assassinate Xietain was a young woman of about 23 years old. Her hair was as blonde in color as the clear rays of the sun, her skin free of imperfections to the naked eye was pale and smooth to the touch, and her body, while not exceptionally developed, was definitely tempting enough to charm any healthy man. The young assassin's beauty was unlike that of any other woman Xietain had met in the past. Her entire body seemed to exude some sort of strange aura that in conjunction with her body made her look like a beautiful rose waiting to be gathered by someone. However, as everyone knew, roses came with thorns, and if one wanted to pick one had to be prepared as there was a likelihood of getting pricked. This woman was that kind of beauty, gorgeous, charming, but at the same time filled with hidden dangers. Although many Chinese men preferred Chinese women, Xietain did not belong to this category. A beauty was a beauty, and the fainting woman was a foreign beauty. It was as simple as that. Gradually, the young assassin opened her eyes. At first, she struggled to adjust to the darkness, and the pain in her body caused her vision to blur for a moment. Soon, however, she could finally see the faces of 4 people illuminated by the nearby fire. Among them, the terrifying young man she had faced earlier was staring at her with ice-cold eyes. Xietain took a step forward and noticed that this girl had jade-green eyes. However, her gaze was cold and indifferent. But unlike Shangguan Bingshue's distant coldness, the coldness in the young assassin's eyes was lethal. "You are finally awake. My name is Xietain." He initiated the conversation. "What is your name? Why did you come here tonight? Why did you try to kill me? Who sent you?" Xietain tried to ask several questions unsuccessfully. No matter what he asked, even if it was something as insignificant as her age or her name, she did not answer in the least and kept her mouth closed. The young foreign assassin simply looked at him coldly. Time passed, and several minutes later, Xietan's patience finally began to run out. He looked at the woman who looked like a wild and untamed horse unwilling to submit, and his expression gradually clouded over. However, Xietain was not a child, at least he did not consider himself one, therefore, he endured. After a moment, he asked another question: "Why didn't you activate your dagger skill?" The young assassin's expression changed slightly, and although it soon returned to normal, Xietain easily noticed how her green eyes moved through the darkness before finally stopping on Shangguan Bingshue, who was holding the young assassin's dagger in her right hand. Just when Xietain thought she would fall silent again, the young assassin finally spoke. Her voice was too soft, like that of a baby, and as sweet as that of an innocent young girl. It was definitely not a voice of an experienced assassin who did not even hesitate to attack lethally. "Give me back my dagger. You want your dagger back?" Xietain nodded calmly. "Sure. I'm willing to give it to you. But first I want you to answer my previous question. Why didn't you activate the skill Death's Kiss earlier? You could have escaped and might have even injured me if you had." Xietain didn't care about the dagger. While it was a powerful magic-grade treasure, it was not a weapon that suited his combat style. Furthermore, while it granted a large number of stat points and possessed a powerful skill, Xietain felt that it was best not to rely too much on external stats as far as possible. For example, in a battle, if your enemy managed to shake your grip onto your weapon and send the weapon flying away from you, then not only would you lose your weapon, but you would also be losing a huge amount of stats, greatly weakening you in the midst of mortal combat. Therefore, Xietain believed that it was better to use weapons that increased physical or magical attack power rather than soul stats. The young assassin looked at Xietain for several seconds. Her green eyes were as sharp and deadly as a pair of daggers. She seemed to be searching for any trace of trickery in his face and gaze, but Xietan's expression remained pure and unchanged. "The reason I didn't activate Death's Kiss in the last moment was because I felt you had no malicious intent towards me." Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 254, 3 verses hundreds, Part 6. "The reason I didn't activate Death's Kiss in the last moment was because I felt you had no malicious intent towards me." After saying these words in a voice that a person engaged in the profession of cold-blooded murder should not have, the young foreign woman looked at everyone's expression with her deep green eyes. While Shangguan Bingshui, Nangong Lingxin, and Nangong Yi looked at her strangely, Xietan's expression was quite amused. He looked at the beautiful assassin, and unconsciously his lips curved slightly upwards. "I say, golden curls, don't you realize the condition of your body? Not only did I pierce your left shoulder with a sharp object, but I also hit you so hard that you lost consciousness after spitting up blood. Are you sure the blow didn't cloud your thoughts? My dagger." The blonde-haired young assassin did not seem to care about the thoughts of the others and instead immediately reclaimed her weapon. Xietain looked at her for a moment before gesturing to Shangguan Bingshui. She understood and approached the dangerous and fatal young woman who was about the same age that he was. After an indifferent glance, she casually cut with her hand, and the fiber strings that bound the woman's movements froze. In the next instant, the tough, hard strings that were sealed in ice began to crack and a moment later exploded into a pile of tiny ice shards, falling to the floor and melting a moment later. The young assassin's expression changed slightly, and she looked at the beautiful silver-haired young woman with surprise in her dangerous jade-green eyes. Previously, she could sense danger from the silver-haired young woman, but it was only when she saw her act that she realized that apart from the young man named Xietain, there was also a second terrifying monster. The assassin took the dagger and staggered to her feet. Her face contorted slightly as even though Xietain restrained himself, her internal organs shook after being hit so hard before she lost consciousness. She did not try to flee. She knew that during her best moment she failed to flee from the hands of the cold-eyed young man, so she would be less able to escape from him now that she was injured. Not to mention the silver-haired beauty with the indifferent expression who was looking at her as if waiting for the moment when she would make a wrong move to attack her. The first thing the young assassin did after standing up and putting away her beloved dagger was to check that her clothes were in order and then her own body. My shoulder. She stared in amazement as the wound on her shoulder had suddenly stopped bleeding. I did it. Xietan's voice immediately attracted her attention. He looked at her calmly and said indifferently, being honest with you, if it wasn't because you didn't activate that dagger skill at the last moment, you would be in a really miserable situation right now. All my enemies always met a not-so-pleasant fate, and those who tried to harm me in any way always failed horribly. With Xietan's blood manipulation skill evolving into second order, not only had the power been multiplied by 2. Xietain had also received a second activation, which granted him the ability to activate a skill attached to blood manipulation. But apart from this, he also received a lot of information in his brain, information that came from the scarlet rune that represented the skill blood manipulation deeply engraved in his soul. Now, while Xietain could not heal wounds or speed up the healing process, he could at least coagulate the blood in a way that would not only seal the wound and prevent the blood from continuing to flow out of the body, he could also do so in such a way that it would not further injure the already injured flesh. After all, controlling globules was not a simple task, and it was not something that could be done just by wanting to do it. The young assassin looked clearly confused. She looked at the 4 people in front of her and finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, asked something that had been bothering her, "Who are you? You're funny." Shangguan Bingshui could no longer stay silent. She stepped forward and said with a slightly mocking tone, "We've been asking you questions, but not only do you not answer, but instead you demand. Who do you think you are? I guess you really haven't realized what kind of situation you're currently in, have you?" Xietain shook his head and looked at the young assassin indifferently. "To be honest, I really wanted to let you go alive. You could say I was looking for an excuse to do so. But seeing as you're not cooperating in any way, then it's fine with me too." The young assassin's expression did not change in the slightest. As an assassin, she knew that at some point she might lose her life, and even more so considering the world she was currently living in. Therefore, she did not flinch in the face of imminent death. Wait a moment. Just then, Nangong Lingxin's voice stopped Xietain. He turned around to look at her over his shoulder and was a little surprised to see her looking at the young assassin's body with a lascivious smile. "Don't you think this woman is beautiful?" Nangong Lingxin narrowed her eyes and said with a chuckle, "I'm sure the poor survivors who haven't been able to feel the warmth of a woman in a long time will thank us eternally if we let them hold her, don't you think?" Shangguan Bingshui and Xietan's expressions changed slightly. Both of them were about to reprimand Nangong Lingxin, as the current her should be aware that throwing a person to their fate while letting others take physical advantage of them was not to both of their liking. In fact, the rule against rape was one of the firmest rules whose punishments were the strongest in Beginning Village. However, the eyes of both of them suddenly lit up as if they had thought of something and unconsciously looked at each other, seeing the same surprise in each other's eyes. Xietain looked at Nangong Lingxin with appreciation, finally understanding the intention of this not only beautiful and powerful but also an intelligent woman. After understanding Nangong Lingxin's plan, Xietain turned to look at the young assassin and smiled. As a man, his smile was even naughtier than Nangong Lingxin's smile, and as he looked at the small but graceful body of the foreign assassin, he commented, "That idea is good too. This woman not only has an extremely good body, but her face is also very beautiful. I'm sure the men who haven't even showered for 1 month will thank us very much. You." The young assassin girl finally couldn't keep her composure and took a step back. She looked at Xietain and the others with caution and even a hint of fear in her previously steady eyes. No woman would be able to keep her calm in the face of being assaulted by a group of men who, to top it off, were filthy and whose putrid odor drove away even the foulest of flies. Even if she was an experienced assassin, she was a woman first and foremost. Xietain sighed exaggeratedly and shook his head. What a pity. A woman as beautiful and strong as you turned into someone else's dog, and because of that stupid loyalty will now have to go through hell before finally dying with grievances. I am nobody's dog. The young assassin suddenly raised her voice, and her fear seemed to disappear. As if the words Xietain said had touched a delicate nerve, she glared at him with hatred and, while gritting her teeth, barked, "The only dogs here are you, who killed a group of people and even steal their belongings casually." Cough. Cough. Xietain and Nangong-yi almost choked to death when they heard this. They killed a group of people? Well, in fact, they killed a lot of people, but they all deserved it in one way or another. As for the matter of stealing their belongings casually. When did this happen? You. What the hell are you talking about? Shangguan Bingshui looked at the young assassin, stupefied. Even if you pretend, it won't do any good. The young female assassin looked at her and coldly snorted. Before I accepted that person's task to kill you, I also did some research. I know that today 12 people walked into this building and never came out again. Several survivors in the area even said that you were robbing the merchants. Nangong Lingxin looked at her 3 teammates, not knowing how to react to such words. Are you mentally retarded or something? Xietain frowned and said in disgust, you think with our strength we need to take some food from someone? We can go to any town or village and get supplies by ourselves. As for those 12 people, each and every one of them were hooligans from a local gang who came with bad intentions and even threatened the life of a 10-year-old girl. Stupid woman. Shangguan Bingshui muttered under her breath and no longer looked at the woman. It seemed that she was afraid of being infected by her stupidity. Although she didn't particularly like men, she didn't like stupid women either. Indeed. The young assassin's expression changed when she heard Xietan's reasoning. She did not belong to any faction. She was a powerful independent soul evolver who, thanks to her power, could enter and leave the base at will. To avoid offending a powerful soul evolver with terrifying assassination capabilities, the North Camp government tolerated her existence. She had even received occasional missions where she was asked to kill a target in exchange for a large amount of supplies and even equipment from the Soul Record System. Today, she was summoned by Kong Rong's right-hand man, one of the 2 most powerful men in the entire base. The name of the man who summoned her was Shan Li, and he currently held the position of commander within the police troops controlled by Kong Rong. Shan Li was literally an existence that was beneath one person and above all others. Shan Li had given her the task of killing a group of people who lived on the west side of the city. This group of people were supposedly cruel and vicious, killing survivors and stealing the private property of merchants. He even presented some evidence. In the end, the young assassin did not immediately agree and asked for some time to think about it. The young assassin had her own principles and never killed people without stains, therefore, she investigated on her own a bit. In the afternoon she soaked in some mud, dirted her hair, and dressed in torn clothes to hide her natural beauty and mingled among the survivors who roamed the area. It was not difficult for her to find that, indeed, a group of 12 people had entered the building but never came out again. She had even gone to talk to the apparently aggrieved vendors and, in fact, these people affirmed Shan Li's words. This was all it took for the young assassin to finally accept the task and kill these people. However, little did she expect that this group of people were not at all normal, but were all soul evolvers. 2 of them could even threaten her life to the point where even running away became impossible for her, despite all her life-saving skills and physical ability. During the fervor of the battle and due to the situation she was in, she had not been able to think carefully even though she already suspected that something was not right. But Xietan's words and the disdainful attitude of the silver-haired, blue-eyed girl finally made her realize what was wrong here. This group of people was so powerful. Did they really need to steal from small vendors? If the government really wanted to deal with a group of seemingly normal people, why didn't they send the police forces to study the murders that happened today instead of contacting her? After thinking things through calmly and when her mind finally cleared, the young assassin finally understood everything. If she managed to kill Bai Zemin's group, then Shanli would be relieved of a burden since this group of 4 people had appeared out of nowhere but was already causing some ripples in the base. Ripples that, while still small, could grow in time. If she failed and died in the process, then that was fine with Shanli too. He would even be rewarded by Kong Rong for removing a variant like her, who was strong and was capable of destabilizing the security of high officials. Those bastards. They dared to use me and fool me. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 255 3 verses hundreds, Part 7. Those bastards. They dared to use me and fool me. Seeing the young assassin girl clenching both fists with an angry expression on her beautiful but lethal face as if she wanted to kill people, everyone inside the room remained silent. Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bing Shui looked at each other for a moment before looking back at the blonde-haired girl once more. Apparently you realized something? Bai Zemin folded his arms and while resting his back against the wall he couldn't help but sneer with clear disdain in his tone of voice. In other words, because of your naivety you not only became our enemy but you might also lose your life. But even more importantly, if it weren't for my group and I having the strength to protect us, you would have killed innocent people. Nangong Yi, Shangguan Bing Shui, and Nangong Lingxin looked at the young woman waiting for an answer. For some reason, now that the misunderstanding seemed to have been cleared up, the 3 of them began to feel a little angry. This anger they felt only increased even more after Bai Zemin said such words. The young assassin, aggrieved, looked at Bai Zemin with her green eyes that seemed to be as cold and sharp as ice blades. However, after several seconds, she sighed and closed her eyes as she relaxed her body and fell to the floor. Although the wound on her shoulder had been sealed by Bai Zemin's second-order blood manipulation skill, the pain still lingered. After all, the flesh wound was still there. Every bone in her body ached horribly as a result of Bai Zemin's final attack that had caused her to lose consciousness. Moreover, the realization that she had been used and the young man's words in front of her were a great shock to her psyche, which weakened her strength even more. Bai Zemin looked at her with indifference. Neither he nor anyone else inside this room had any intention of going to support the beauty. After several minutes of silence where the only thing that could be heard was the sound of wood slowly burning, the young assassin sighed again before raising her head to look at everyone, especially Bai Zemin since he was the person she had attacked. I honestly apologize for what happened. Although I know that a word of apology is nothing but empty words, my true feelings right now are that I sincerely regret it. Bai Zemin looked at her for a moment and realized that the woman in front of him had changed her temperament. While her eyes were still cold, they no longer looked as lethal as before and all her guard seemed to have completely disappeared. As if that wasn't enough, her baby voice became even softer after realizing that she was completely wrong in this situation. In the past, saying sorry wasn't worth anything. Less so now that the world and the laws that protected us collapsed. Bai Zemin replied coldly. However, he soon smiled slightly and continued, but while an apology might not be enough, how about you join us? Don't be so quick to refuse, how about you listen to me first? Bai Zemin waved his hand and stopped her words before she could continue. The young assassin hesitated for a moment. She was a lone wolf. From a very young age, she had to survive on her own in this world after losing everything she had. Her trust in people was not high to begin with, and joining a faction of this new world was not something she had in her plans. In the past, humans were evil and selfish people who took advantage of the slightest disadvantage of the other in order to take advantage of any situation. What more now that the world had changed? However, surprisingly even for her, in the end, she decided to listen to what the young man in front of her had to say. Although it was a surprise even for her to be willing to listen as this could translate into her at least being interested in the offer, she had her own reasons why she did this. Of course, in the end, it would all depend on what the young man in front of her said. How about we reintroduce ourselves? Now that all this misunderstanding was cleared up, it would be better to at least put the enmity aside for a brief moment. Bai Zemin smiled slightly and reintroduced himself, being followed closely after by Nangong Lingxin, Nangong Yi, and Shangguan Bing Shui. My name? As if hesitating about something, the young assassin finally gritted her teeth and responded in a somewhat stiff tone, my name is Evangeline. Just Evangeline, you may consider that I have no surname. As for my background, I think my mother was Chinese and my father Russian. Xietain and the rest looked at each other for a moment before looking back at the woman who now rested her back comfortably against the wall and looked at them with clear eyes. They all realized from the words she spoke at the end of her sentence that this woman named Evangeline had her own story to tell as well. I see. Nice to meet you, Evangeline. Xietain nodded with a faint smile. Every person in this world had their own past. Some had a good life filled with fortunes, others had a normal life with ups and downs, while those less privileged by fate had to step on hot fathoms with every step they took, enduring endless pain and gritting their teeth in every moment so as not to fall down, as it would be hard to get up once again. As to whether one was willing to share their life experiences with another person, it depended on many factors such as trust. After everyone finished introducing themselves, Xietain put on a serious expression and began to tell the whole truth. From who the four of them were to where they came from and why they were here, he did not hide anything. While it was true that Evangeline was an unknown person and neither Xietain nor the others had any confidence in her whatsoever, if they wholeheartedly wanted her to join their faction, lies were not a good way to start a relationship. Xietain, who had fought this woman, knew that if everything went well, then he had a lot to gain and little to lose in case things did not go his way. If Evangeline joined him, then he would be gaining an extremely powerful and terrifying ally. She would immediately occupy an extremely high position, being the second or third most powerful person in the faction right behind him and fighting against Shangguan Bingshui for the second place. If it was in a normal match, Shangguan Bingshui undoubtedly had the ability to 100% overwhelm Evangeline. However, if it was a sudden assault, even Shangguan Bingshui could be seriously injured and potentially even die depending on the situation she was in at the time. As for the worst-case scenario, if Evangeline was pretending to be friendly to flee, then Xietain had nothing to lose since he did not believe that she would go running to the North Camp government to tell everything he told her. After all, she had been tricked and almost killed by the machinations of the other party. But even then, if Evangeline really did go running to the government to tell everything, Xietain didn't care about any of this. He was 100% confident that he could bring down this base completely even if he was alone, not to mention that he had powerful soul evolvers standing by his side. About half an hour later, Xietain had finished giving Evangeline a pretty big idea about the situation of his faction and the way it functioned. From the current population to the rules, punishments, and divisions of labor. Even the rewards for the efforts put in by each person were not left out by him. Evangeline lowered her head and was silent after listening to everything Xietain told her. Although she showed no apparent reaction, the shock she received was by no means small. If everything the young man in front of her told her was true, then this base was doomed. But more crucially, she looked him straight into his eyes and stood up slowly as she said earnestly, "About the society you want to build. I am willing to join you, but I have 2 conditions." "More conditions, huh?" Xietain unconsciously looked at Shangguan Bingshui and couldn't help but think that women really were something. But on second thought, it also made sense. Evangeline was strong, she could survive on her own for quite some time, and as long as she didn't encounter some especially strong first-order beast, as long as she didn't find herself surrounded by an army of beasts or a group of first-order beasts, and as long as she didn't meet a terrifying second-order existence, Evangeline had enough power to survive in this new world. By joining his faction, she would be losing much of her freedom, as she would not only have to listen to the orders Xietain gave her, but would also have to work to raise a person even higher than she was raising herself. Therefore, taking all this into account, it was only natural that she and any other powerhouse would have their conditions. Sure, Xietain could threaten her with death, but for an assassin like Evangeline, it was clear that such threats would have little or no effect. On the contrary, they might make everything more difficult. "Don't worry." Evangeline looked at him steadily and said confidently, "I have only 2 conditions. The first will not prejudice you in any way as long as everything you have said before is true. As for my second condition, it might even be considered a good thing for you." "Oh?" Xietain finally felt some curiosity. With a faint smile on his face, his eyes flashed with a hint of coldness as he calmly said, "An advantageous condition for me? That's quite interesting. Tell me what you have in mind." "My first condition is simple. Before I agree to join your faction and follow your orders, I want to go to your camp and see how you operate it. Besides, I also want to see how you try to solve the problems that the lower caste survivors have. Evangeline said calmly. Although she was a killer and the number of people who had died at her hands before the Soul Record's arrival on Earth could already be counted in more than a few dozen, she was not a cruel person and thus was not willing to follow a selfish and evil person. Xietain nodded. Such a condition was understandable. Seeing him nod, Evangeline paused for a moment before saying word by word, following China. In case I really join your faction and we succeed in conquering China, you cannot stop here. My second and final condition is that you proceed north towards Russia and conquer its lands as well. Cough. 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 Nangong-yi began to cough furiously and for a moment seemed to run out of air in his lungs as his face turned red. Nangong Lingxin looked at the young assassin with wide eyes and her small mouth opened slightly. Her eyes seemed to be looking at a lunatic person instead of someone sane. Even Xietain himself could not help but be startled when he heard Evangeline's second condition. What kind of strange condition was this? Did she have something against the Russians? Did it have something to do with her past? Xietain felt he could not process what was happening. Surprisingly, the only person who had no reaction of surprise was Shangguan Bingshui, Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 256, 3 verses hundreds, Part 8. You want me after conquering China to advance to the north of the continent to conquer Russia? Xietain finally reacted after almost a solid minute of silence. To be completely honest, Evangeline's second condition was too much of a surprise for him. Rather than a condition, perhaps it would be more appropriate to call it a request since, just as she said earlier, in fact such a thing would be advantageous for him. If Xietain really did advance northward and ended up conquering Russia, not only would he be gaining a large number of survivors, manpower, and experts, but also many doors filled with possibilities would appear before him. After all, Russia was one of the countries with the largest land area, and therefore its resources were also incredibly rich. In this new mana-influenced world, not only humans and animals were constantly evolving. Plants began to evolve and some of them turned into valuable treasures like the 1,000 lightning plant that Xietain found at that time in the female dorms of the university. But besides plants, according to Lilith, the world should have different metals and materials incredibly valuable to the current him and his faction, materials that in the past did not exist, that were just fantasy, and that could only come into being after mana and magic evolved, mutated, or created them. Of course, while it was true that the advantages were enormous, so were the dangers. In just one of China's many districts, Xietain had had the misfortune of meeting several terrifying enemies that put his life in risk several times. Had it not been for his cunning and tactics to defeat those who were stronger, he would have long since become a corpse and a source of power that would boost the victor's growth. So how hard would it be to explore and conquer Russia? It would undoubtedly be more difficult than China. After all, Xietain could grow in this land because it was his homeland. But this would not be the case in foreign lands. It would be extremely difficult to get the Russians to entrust their lives to a foreigner, and not to mention that Xietain did not know the terrain of the northern country. Right. That is my last condition. Evangeline did not hesitate and nodded. She looked at him with a serious expression and continued, "You don't need to worry. If in the future you have the power to conquer China, then who's to say you won't be able to do the same with Russia? Besides, I will be there to help you. It won't be so difficult then, don't you think? In fact, with the help of a Russian woman such as Evangeline, everything would be simpler." It was just that Xietain had never thought so far ahead. For now, all he wanted was to become the highest authority in China before the world entered its second stage of evolution. Because during those 7 days when he and Lilith stayed inside his workshop, she told him that something big would happen during the change and that he would need to dominate a world power or he would regret it forever. As to what would happen, Xietain had no idea. But he trusted Lilith 99%, so he practically did not even doubt her words. It was then that the idea of becoming king and eventually emperor was born within him. At that moment, an indifferent voice that was not Evangeline's brought Xietain out of his deep thoughts. "Why are you so surprised?" He turned slightly and looked at Shangguan Bingshui, who was looking at him with her blue eyes that seemed to be as deep as the ocean but as calm as a lake without ripples. If you rule China in the future, then you will definitely try to rule the rest of the countries in Asia. Gradually you will even try to reach Europe, and then America. Shangguan Bingshui said as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Don't you know how the mind of us, humans, works? Once you achieve your goal, ambitions start to grow, which gives birth to a new goal higher than the previous one. Bai Zemin could not refute her words. Human beings were greedy and nonconformist by nature. It was because of this greed and nonconformity that technology advanced and humans learned not only more about the world they lived in but also about part of outer space. However, this also had its disadvantages. And that was that because of these two characteristics, it was very difficult for a human to be truly happy with what they had. When a person was thirsty, they wanted a glass of water. But when that thirst was satisfied, the same person wished for a plate of food to satisfy their hunger. But when that hunger was satiated, that same person wished for a coat to protect against the cold. And when that person finally got that coat, he or she wished for a house to protect him or herself from the rain. It was an endless and never-ending cycle, just like the cycle of life and death. Understanding this, Nangong Yi and Nangong Lingxin realized that in fact, there was no need to be too surprised. Just as Shangguan Bingshui said just now, it was in the human DNA not to conform. Besides, if they really had the power to rule one of the largest and most powerful countries such as China, then why couldn't they have the power to rule other countries? Unconsciously, Shangguan Bingshui's words planted a small seed in the hearts of the Nangong siblings, and the way they looked at Bai Zemin changed. It was as if they were looking at the savior. As to whether she did it on purpose or not, probably only she was aware. In the end, Bai Zemin sighed and after hesitating, nodded, "I accept your conditions. However, all of this is based on your strength and your contribution being worthy. If your strength lags behind, if you disobey my orders, or if your merits are not worth mentioning, then you can forget that this conversation ever existed. If you are okay with it, then we can close the deal here. Otherwise you can leave." "Very well. I agree." Evangeline also realized that this was the most that Bai Zemin was willing to give in, so she didn't push any further. She just had to continue acting as she had been acting since day one of the apocalypse and everything would be fine. "Perfect then." Bai Zemin smiled slightly and extended his right hand, "Welcome aboard." Evangeline looked at his outstretched hand for 1 second before extending her own to give him a handshake in greeting. "Though I still need to see your faction and how you work with it, based on your current confidence I think I won't be disappointed. You can rest assured in that regard." Nangong Yi sighed lightly and pointed out, "Believe me when I say that compared to this base, the faction established by Bai Zemin and the others is a paradise." Shangguan Bingshui seized the opportunity and interjected, "So, can you explain everything? How did you come here and who sent you to attack us?" Evangeline gritted her teeth and said hatefully, "Just thinking about it pisses me off. Those damn bastards are really cruel." Then, she explained the whole situation and the process without leaving out important details. About 5 minutes later, Bai Zemin's group finally understood everything. "I must say that this fellow named Shanli is really quite a clever rat." Bai Zemin chuckled. However, his eyes flashed with almost undetectable coldness as he said, "Not only did he pay off several storekeepers to pretend to be victims of robbery, but I dare say he also mixed truths with lies so that you wouldn't find out that the 12 people we killed today were actually unprincipled scum." Indeed. From the moment Shanli contacted Evangeline, he already had everything planned. He had even paid a certain amount of food to several storekeepers to be part of the farce so that when she went to inquire into the situation on her own before accepting the mission, the storekeepers acted as if they had really suffered injustice. Bai Zemin looked out of the window and was deep in thought as the others looked at him waiting for his decision. However, Shangguan Bingshui already knew what his next move would be. After all, she already knew him well enough since even though they had only known each other for a little over a month, a lot had happened during that period of time, enough for her to know what kind of person Bai Zemin was. He was definitely not one to take personal attacks with a smile. "I guess we'll start tonight then." Bai Zemin's words confirmed Shangguan Bingshui's thoughts and she shrugged, "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't expecting it." Bai Zemin turned his face slightly to look at her and said calmly, "Although I would really like to get sleep a short nap, I think it will be better if we sleep comfortably in a bed, don't you think? I can't say no to that." She nodded and couldn't help but chuckle. You two sure are innocent. Nangong Lingxin covered her mouth and giggled softly as she looked at the two of them. Eh? What do you mean? Bai Zemin did not understand. Shangguan Bing Shui looked at her in confusion as well. Nangong Yi shook his head and said with a faint smile, next time, you should be careful with your words, Bai Zemin. Huh? Bai Zemin really couldn't keep up with these two. What was the thing he said wrong? Nangong Yi and Nangong Lingxin looked at Shangguan Bing Shui, but seeing her indifferent and confused at the same time, the two siblings looked at each other dumbfounded. Maybe our dirty mind is what's wrong here. Nangong Lingxin smiled bitterly and Nangong Yi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. So, Evangeline interrupted, we are attacking tonight itself? Bai Zemin looked at her and frowned slightly as he asked quietly, you can move with your current condition? It's not that I'm trying to offend or demean you, but what we're going to do next is break into Kongrong's village, and from what I understand the defense there is incredibly tight. Nangong Lingxin nodded and her expression turned serious, that's true. I've been there a couple of times with my brother and we've counted around 300 men stationed at different key points. Several of them are powerful soul evolvers that cannot be underestimated. Evangeline frowned when she heard this. In fact, she had never been to Kongrong's village, but she had observed from afar and knew that sneaking in would not be easy even for her. Forget about attacking from the front then. The frown on Evangeline's beautiful face deepened even more when she realized that with her current condition it would be dangerous for her to attack Kongrong's village. Although she was not severely injured in any way, the pain she felt all over her body did not allow her to move freely and normally. After all, it had only been about 2 hours since she and Bai Zemin fought. It would take her at least 10 more hours to fully recover, and by then the sun would be peeking over the horizon. Challenging several soul evolvers and challenging hundreds of heavily armed men in her current state would be no different than suicide. In the end, Evangeline raised both hands in surrender. Forget it then, I guess I'll just stay here. Bai Zemin nodded with a faint smile, that's probably better. Then, he looked at Nangong Yi and said calmly, Nangong Yi, stay here and protect Yifeng and Xiang Feng. If anyone dares to sneak into the building or cause trouble, just kill them immediately without hesitation. I understand. Nangong Yi nodded with a solemn expression. While he was strong, his potential was not in fighting many enemies, but a few yet powerful ones. It would be dangerous for him to defy a hail of bullets. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 257 3 verses Hundreds, Part 9. Under Evangeline's watchful eye, Bai Zemin walked to a corner of the room and crouched down before starting to remove some candy wrappers and other types of miscellaneous junk. Then, he carefully picked up a few things from the floor and turned around. Then, since Nangong Yi and Evangeline will be staying here, it will just be Shangguan Bing Shui, Nangong Lingxin, and me. Shangguan Bing Shui stepped forward and took some things from his hand. Nangong Lingxin as well did the same a moment later. What is that? Evangeline was surprised and confused as she watched the two beautiful women in front of her carefully holding on to some small items. Toys? A satisfied smile appeared on Bai Zemin's face as he calmly said, I'm glad you think so since that means the others will most likely think that way too. Then, he walked over to the bag containing the snack food and scattered it on the floor before he started tearing a part of the bag, revealing a well-hidden part at the bottom area. What is this person doing? Evangeline was dumbfounded. She assumed that Bai Zemin and the rest had heavy weapons hidden somewhere and that they would probably go and get them before launching an attack. However, all they did was stand there while one of them performed suspicious actions. However, her questions were soon answered to some extent. A gun? No. What kind of item is that? Again, eyes wide open, the young assassin who had just joined Bai Zemin's faction saw him pull out a strange futuristic-looking gun she had never seen in her entire life from inside the torn bag. Now you'll see. Nangong Lingxin replied with a chuckle before leaving the armor and miniature sword in her hands on the ground. Shangguan Bing Shui said nothing and simply did the same as Nangong Lingxin before taking a few steps back prior to fixing her stare on Bai Zemin. As for Bai Zemin, he didn't beat around the bush either. After taking his equipment that had been shrunk by the epic-grade treasure called Infinite Reduction, Bai Zemin placed them all side by side on the ground. However, although it was fine with the armor, shoulder pads, and the rest, when the scabbard and miniature sword came into contact with the ground once again, the ground trembled slightly. The trembling was extremely small, and a normal person would not notice it. However, Evangeline was not a normal person. She was a powerful first-order soul evolver and an experienced assassin capable of detecting the changes happening around her. Her face changed slightly when she felt the small movement of the ground and looked at the small toys with surprise. She had her theories about it but was unwilling to believe it. However, she soon had no choice but to accept the reality before her eyes. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Xietain aimed at the pile of miniature objects and fired 3 times. Once he shot at Shangguan Bingshue's miniature objects. The second shot was aimed at Nangong Lingxin's objects. The last one was directly in front of him. 3 beams of light similar to a scanner shot out from the muzzle of the gun, and the light enveloped the miniature objects for a few seconds. Then, under Evangeline's disbelief-filled gaze, those small objects that looked like children's toys began to increase in size at breakneck speeds. Before her beautiful jade-green eyes, approximately a dozen pieces of equipment appeared. Armor, shoulder pads, swords, scabbards, wrist guards, etc. There was even a large dark cloak that looked like it had experienced many battles as it had some jagged parts on it. Nangong Yi can explain things to you later. Xietain naturally understood the woman's surprise. However, he did not have time at the moment, so he could only arrange everything in such a way. You two should also prepare yourselves. Xietain instructed as he looked at the 2 women who would be accompanying him on tonight's raid. Shangguan Bingshue and Nangong Lingxin nodded simultaneously before they began to move. The 2 women took their equipment into a separate room and closed the door. Soon, the sound of leather plates, scabbards, and swords crafted from evolved monster materials could be heard from the living room. Xietain also did the same. He took his things and disappeared into a different room. The first to appear were Shangguan Bingshue and Nangong Lingxin. One dressed in sky blue leather armor and the other in brown leather armor. The 2 beauties looked extremely proud and brave as their swords sealed inside their scabbards hung around their small waists. Actually, Nangong Lingxin was more of a mage than a warrior, so she was supposed to have a magic staff instead of a sword. However, Xietain did not know that she had joined the group until after he came out of his confinement. Precisely for this reason, Nangong Lingxin and her brother Nangong Yi could only use normal pieces of equipment that Xietain had forged in large quantities and had been distributed among 200 brave men who did have the courage to fight the zombies and other melee enemies at the risk of their lives. About 5 minutes later, Xietain also appeared in the living room. The flames had consumed the wood almost entirely, so the lighting in the room was quite dim at this point. Not bad. Nangong Yi couldn't help but exclaim as he looked at Xietain standing there. The constant movement of the small yellow flames was faintly reflected on the black leather armor and the spikes protruding from it. On his back could be seen the hilt that went beyond his height of a giant red scabbard that for barely a dozen centimeters did not touch the ground. I will need time to practice, Xietain said as a breeze of cold air blew through the broken windows, causing the large dark cloak behind him to wave gently. Almost 10 minutes to equip these things? Even if it's the first time I've seen this kind of stuff, it's too long. As he lamented and made a mental note, the 4 people in the room stared at him. Sensing this, Xietain finally couldn't help but feel a little secretly proud. In fact, he had seen himself before leaving the room, so he knew that at this moment he looked really brave and heroic. Besides, the black color of his equipment gave him an air of mystery and danger that naturally attracted stares. Although Xietain could be considered quite mature for his age, he was still a young man in his 20s. It was absolutely impossible for him not to feel good when 3 beautiful women were staring at him, even if he didn't know what they were thinking. Catching their attention certainly didn't feel bad, even though it wasn't something he cared too much about. We should go. Shangguan Bingshue closed her eyes for a moment before opening them once more as she walked outside. Yep. Let's finish this quickly and then go to sleep. Xietain followed her. I want to sleep in a big comfy bed. But first I need a bubble bath. Nangong Lingxin also expressed her wishes. Although this building had hot water, the shower was not good, so she really missed her villa in Beginning Village. Soon, the 3 silhouettes disappeared in the middle of the night. The weather was quite cold at this time. Even when the soul record stabilized the mana that had gone wild as it sensed the approach of this mysterious system to Earth, the temperatures were volatile. Even if during the day the sun burned fiercely making living beings sweat, during the nights it could become as cold as the nights of the desolate deserts. Except for a few survivors who wandered the streets like souls in pain, apparently unable to even feel the cold that embraced them, and with dead eyes and no hope for the future, all were inside their homes. 3 silhouettes moved like ghosts, taking advantage of the veil of the night. The 3 silhouettes were extremely agile and their movements were undoubtedly inhuman. The speed at which they advanced was such that when they passed by a survivor, he or she could not even notice them, and the only thing they felt was a gust of wind, colder and stronger than natural, whipping their bodies. In a very short time, the 3 shadows had left the western part of the base, and without stopping their movements, they continued advancing in a southeasterly direction. Unlike the rest of the base, which was practically in total darkness, the eastern area was very well illuminated. The buildings were extravagant and the gardens luxurious. In addition, security in the area was especially tight, as different squads, consisting of at least 5 men, could be seen patrolling the area every few minutes. "I guess the smooth ride ends here," Xietain commented calmly as he stood on a 5-story building and looked below it. Shangguan Bingshui remained silent without saying a word. On the other hand, Nangong Lingxin looked at him and asked a little worriedly, "Now what shall we do?" Xietain thought about it for a moment, but no matter how many turns he gave the matter, he failed to come up with a solution. "Even if we are fast, our speed hasn't reached the point of being as fast as light and being undetectable. Even though these troops are composed of only normal men, the human eye will definitely be able to catch our shadows if we're unlucky, and that will attract them sooner or later. Not only that," Shangguan Bingshui added while looking at the surroundings, "even if you use your skill invisibility to take out several of them, sooner or later a team will notice that something is wrong, and it will only be a matter of time before they start looking for us. After all, this is the privileged area, and there are plenty of troops roaming the eastern area. Indeed, aside from these troops protecting the general area, Kong Rong has a large number of men in his village." So, Nangong Lingxin seemed to realize something and looked at Xietain again, waiting for his confirmation. "We have no choice." Xietain nodded and took a step forward. His body was dragged by gravity, plummeting off the building. Due to the weight he was carrying, it only took a moment for him to reach the ground. However, just before his feet touched the concrete floor and caused a rumble, he waved his hand and, expending a few mana points, his descent speed stalled for a split second, so that when his body finally reached the solid ground, the only sound heard was a tiny thud. A troop of 5 armed men patrolling the perimeter zone, whose job it was to prevent normal survivors from reaching this area where only the privileged could enter, suddenly stalled as they saw a person appear before their eyes out of nowhere, as if he had fallen from the sky. The wild clothing and appearance, as well as the domineering aura exuded by this person's body, made the 5 men instinctively sense danger, and they did not hesitate to raise their firearms. However, before they could even move, the world around them suddenly became completely dark. They all fell heavily to the ground, unconscious. Shangguan Bingshui and Nangong Lingxin appeared behind Xietain a second later. "Let's try to knock out as many as we can. After all, these troops might join us soon, and the fewer deaths the better for us," Xietain said as he dashed forward, and the 2 women followed a short distance behind. "If anyone shoots or tries to stop us, just kill them." Shangguan Bingshui and Nangong Lingxin said nothing and simply nodded silently. Because security was tight, the group could no longer move around freely. Therefore, after knocking a total of 30 men completely incapacitated and out of action, someone finally reached out and fired a shot. The sound of the gunshot echoed in the middle of the silent night, attracting the attention of the other guards. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 258, 3 vs. Hundreds, Part 10 last. The group of 3 led by Xietain had done a wonderful job. The eastern part of the north camp was undoubtedly the most secure part of the entire base, even more secure than the outer perimeters of the walls where some mutated beast or zombie could sneak in. After all, this was where the people with real power lived. With around 200 men making rounds in groups of several units, the area 2 or 3 kilometers around could be considered very safe, as each and every one of these men was armed with a rifle or a machine gun. In addition, several snipers with some experience were monitoring the ground from a distance, preparing to turn the head of any enemy into a mess of blood. However, Xietan's group evaded a great part of this tight security. After knocking out almost 10 entire teams to total around 30 men, Xietain together with Shangguan Bingshui and Nangong Lingxin moved into the sparse shadows of the trees and carefully advanced deeper into the privileged zone. Although the three of them were powerful soul evolvers, it was extremely difficult to knock out their current enemies without killing them. After all, there were many things to take into account, such as preventing one of them from firing their guns, preventing them from screaming, avoiding being seen by another squadron while carrying out the task, etc. Unfortunately, luck finally ran out for the group of three before they could reach their target destination. A group of 4 armed men was casually chatting as they walked down one of the lighted streets in the privileged area. The 4 men did not look particularly worried, and their guard was quite low at the moment. From the point of view of these armed men, it was simply impossible for anyone to attack this area unless that enemy had a desire to meet their death before their time. After all, in the privileged area, there were not only hundreds of armed troops, but also dozens of powerful soul evolvers on duty, and several more currently resting comfortably in their villas. Swoosh! Swoosh! Xietain and Shangguan Bingshui dashed out like 2 shadows from behind a large bush. The agility of these two was so high that their targets could not even react before falling to the ground unconscious. With a considerably lower agility than Xietain and Shangguan Bingshui, Nangong Lingxin appeared before a male officer dressed in a police uniform and was about to knock him out when something happened that she did not expect. The man was so scared by the sudden ghostly appearance of a woman that the finger of his hand, which was unconsciously on the trigger of the pistol in his hand, was pressed down. The result was obvious. Bang! Damn it! Nangong Lingxin couldn't help but curse, even though she considered herself quite polite. Angry, she couldn't help but use a little more strength when she slapped the man. The sound of bones rang out in the middle of the night along with the echoing gunshot, and the man fell lifeless on the ground with blood pouring out of his eyes, nose, mouth, and ears. Prepare to fight, Xietain said calmly. Shangguan Bingshui nodded and her blue eyes flashed coldly. The temperature around her suddenly began to plummet as a thick layer of ice formed under her feet. I'm sorry. Nangong Lingxin apologized with a miserable expression. She knew that because of her mistake, they would now have things more difficult. Why are you apologizing? Xietain looked at her in confusion and said indifferently, sooner or later we would be discovered anyway, and no matter if it was late or if it was early, the final outcome of this battle is written in stone. Hearing his words, Nangong Lingxin felt a little better. Lead the way. We are looking for that dog surnamed Calm. Xietain waved his hand and ordered in a deep voice. Got it. Nangong Lingxin nodded and moved forward, leading the way since she was the only one among the three who knew the area well. After all, she used to live in this area of the base in the past. Shangguan Bingshui and Xietain followed Nangong Lingxin calmly. Their footsteps were leisurely and carefree, as if they were taking a walk in the park. In no way did they look like people who were about to face a powerful army of armed men and soul evolvers. The previous shot had alerted the surroundings, and soon the whole base was agitated. The nearest men began to move hurriedly to the eastern area, and those already there moved to the location of the earlier explosion. Stop. Less than 60 seconds later, a group of 50 armed men appeared in front of the group of 3, blocking the way forward. All of these men carried light machine guns and rifles, while some of them only had Type 54 pistols. Dressed in police uniforms, they all looked at the 3 people in front of them with extreme caution and wariness. Xietan's group looked extremely brave and powerful with their shining armor and swords. Xietain ignored these people and calmly said, "Protect yourself and Shangguan Bingshui. You don't need to worry about me." Nangong Lingxin nodded and pointed her right hand forward. When the gunmen saw her raise her hand, they thought she was going to attack, so the person in charge immediately ordered to open fire. Bang! 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 The gun barrels roared, seemingly endless tongues of fire, and a storm of metal rained down on the 3 people. Flash! A multicolored light flashed out from Nangong Lingxin's pearly hand. The multicolored light spread out at several times the speed of bullets and in a moment had become a barrier 2 meters high and 2 meters wide. Tink. 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 The terrifying metal bullets filled with lethal power struck the magic barrier and bounced uselessly before falling powerlessly to the ground, completely collapsed and crushed while the barrier did not even flinch, let alone show signs of breaking. Behind the magic barrier, Nangong Lingxin and Shangguan Bingshui had indifferent expressions on their beautiful faces. Both women continued to move forward calmly and fearlessly despite facing 100 firearms. Your skill really is impressive. Bai Zemin couldn't help but praise as he saw how effective Nangong Lingxin's first-order energy barrier skill was. It was undoubtedly an incredibly powerful defensive skill. As for himself, even though he wasn't being protected by Nangong Lingxin's magic barrier, since the bigger the barrier, the higher the mana consumption, the bullets couldn't hurt him in the slightest. Tink. 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 When the bullets hit Bai Zemin's body, his bloodthirsty wolf full body armor acted like an impenetrable wall, repelling the bullets, causing them to bounce off the surface and fall to the ground without being able to cause him even the slightest amount of pain. In fact, Bai Zemin did not even feel the slightest knockback power at all, despite the armor sticking quite tightly to his body. As for his unprotected head, he simply crossed both arms in front of him and protected 80% of it with the armor protecting his arm area. As for the other 20%, while it caused him some pain, this level of pain was nothing to a person like him who had already experienced the horrors of being burned in life and had already suffered from having his bones crushed into dust. He calmly moved forward as the women followed close behind. Damn it, they're soul evolvers. Where did these monsters come from? They can even defy bullets. The gunman turned pale and began to retreat while shooting bursts. For every step Bai Zemin's group took forward, the gunman retreated too. A few seconds later, the 50 or so men ran out of ammunition and turned to flee as they threw their guns to the ground. Although they wore police uniforms, most of them were just ordinary citizens who were recently recruited, so they had little courage to fight, let alone against clearly overwhelmingly more powerful enemies. Bai Zemin and his group did not bother with these people as they did not represent even a small obstacle to them. While they could have killed them all, humanity needed people willing to fight even if it was with firearms. Besides, since Bai Zemin would soon be taking control of this base, it would be best for him to kill as little as possible. After all, these troops would soon be his. Several armed groups appeared and tried to stop Bai Zemin's group, but they were all repelled. The smarter ones fled at the first sign of trouble, while the braver ones decided to fight to the bitter end. Those who fled were spared by Bai Zemin, but those who continued to block his path, despite the constant warnings he gave them, were mercilessly slaughtered. In less than 5 minutes, a total of approximately 250 men were repulsed by only 3 people without even fighting. Among these 250 armed men, approximately 70 of them were killed by Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui. Some armed men seemed to realize that the mysterious group of 3 people did not seem to have the intention of killing those who did not bother them too much, so they dared to watch from afar while following them from a distance. Even though these people no longer dared to attack, they wanted to see what was going to happen next. Should I kill them all? Shangguan Bingshui asked coldly as she looked back and saw around 60 men following them. She did not have any good impression of this base, even though it had only been about 17 hours since she had arrived here. The level of corruption and cruelty of the high officials had caused even someone indifferent and cold like her to become angry, so she didn't mind killing several people. Bai Zemin looked over his shoulder and shook his head. Just ignore them. They won't dare raise their guns against us again unless they actually have air instead of brains inside their heads. Shangguan Bingshui nodded indifferently and did not say anything else. She also did not pay attention to the people following them from afar again. In the past, they posed no danger at all, and now that they were low on ammunition, that already non-existent danger had diminished even more, if that was even possible. Suddenly, Bai Zemin sensed a slight danger as his passive skill Danger Sense activated. This danger was by no means deadly and barely noticeable, which meant that the incoming attack could only, at most, slightly injure him and nothing serious. On top of a 5-story building a kilometer up the street, a woman lay on the floor as she clung to her Barrett sniper. In the crosshairs of the lens, she watched as a young man and two young women defied hundreds of gunmen as if they were nothing. Even without attacking, all the troops were defeated by their presence alone and didn't even suffer a scratch in the process. What monsters! The woman whispered in lingering fear. She was a powerful soul evolver. Her current level was 19, but her actual strength allowed her to kill higher-level existences thanks to her two main skills. Even a first-order human could be injured by her, as humans had weak physiques by nature. It's a shame since she ran into me though. The female sniper licked her lips and activated her two attack skills, mana reinforcement and ammo enhancement. Both were unclassified skills, but with her Barrett, who was even capable of piercing an armored jeep, her power was incredibly terrifying. Die, pretty boy. She smiled and pulled the trigger with confidence. Bang! A thunderous sound shook the night sky. The power of the shot had been such that the Barrett jerked ferociously as if it would break at any moment, while the floor beneath the woman cracked slightly. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 259 Massacre descends from the sky. Even amidst the sound of engines approaching from a distance and amidst the occasional gunfire as the gunmen confronted by Xiein's group, the sniper's shot resounded in such a way that it was like thunder descending from the heavens in the middle of a starry, cloudless night. Xiein's eyes flashed and his body moved first, before his mind sent the order. As if the survival instinct had already taken root deep inside him, he glanced out of the corner of his eye to his left and raised his hand to head height just a second before the bullet hit him. Bang! The sniper bullet, empowered by two skills that took its power to new heights, slammed into Xiein's palm. More specifically, the bullet meant to take his life impacted on the rank 1 Skullbreaker glove. Man, that hurts. Xietain waved his left hand a couple of times as he grimaced at the sight of the clear white-colored mark on the bottom of the previously all-black glove. Even though the penetrating and deadly power of the bullet was denied, Xietain actually felt the flesh on his hand seem to be squeezed by a pair of hard and firm pincers. If it wasn't for his high stamina, health, and strength, that attack would have definitely made him bleed. He turned his gaze to his left side and, as if his gaze traveled through a space-time tunnel, his cold stare met the panicked gaze of the female sniper several hundred meters distance away. The female sniper could not believe her eyes. A sniper's eyes were everything, but for the first time, she would not and could not believe what her eyes were showing her. She could understand if the enemy wasn't killed after receiving her strongest attack. But forget about dying, the mysterious young man caught the bullet with his hands as if he was catching a tennis ball. Just as she was going to prepare a second shot, she saw the silver-haired girl standing next to the terrifying young man suddenly raise her right hand and conjure up a 5-meter ice spear. The ice spear flew in her direction as the silver-haired young woman waved her hand gracefully. The sniper could not help but smile bitterly as she saw the spear about to pierce her head. Not only was that young man hard as a mountain, but that silver-haired girl next to him was incredibly lethal. Even the other young woman who had so far not attacked had a frighteningly powerful defensive skill. Where did these three monsters come from? The woman thought before the spear finally reached her head. However, just as she had already given up and prepared to accept the Reaper's embrace, the ice spear stopped an inch away right between her eyebrows. A bead of sweat slid down her face as her terrified eyes once again met the gaze of the two monsters nearly 1 kilometer away. Under her eyes filled with disbelief, the silver-haired girl said something to the mysterious young man before waving her hand. The ice spear that threatened her life exploded and turned into small ice fragments that fell to the floor slowly before melting. The female sniper looked down at her Barrett and sighed as she said, "Let's go home." She disassembled her weapon and carefully stowed it in a briefcase before calmly exiting the building. She understood what the young man in black armor and the beautiful silver-haired woman meant to transmit to her. The previous attack was a warning, and she had no doubt that she would die if she continued to be stubborn. She was only working for Kongrong for profit anyway. But if her life was the price to pay, then she would rather not get involved in these matters. After finishing this and making a few arrangements, I would like that sniper to join us. Xietain commented calmly as he continued to move forward. Our group currently only has Chen He as a professional sniper, the rest can only hit the target at a maximum of 500 meters far away since they only started training a few weeks ago. It would be good if that sniper joins us later. Shangguan Bing Shui agreed with what he said. You two are really Nangong Lingxin forced a smile as she said, "The battle isn't even over, but you're already thinking of recruiting enemies?" Shangguan Bingshui looked at her and said indifferently, "What do you mean? Didn't we tell you before that this battle was already over before it started?" Nangong Lingxin sighed and shook her head. Sometimes it was hard to tell if the two people beside her were incredibly arrogant or if their words really came from their self-confidence. "More are coming." Bai Zemin pointed ahead. A truck was approaching with several menacing-looking armed men. "Although it's a pity, we'd better hurry up a bit. Otherwise, there will be no end to this." After saying that, he pointed forward and the blazing ring on his index finger momentarily glowed before a large crimson flame burst forward. The flames coalesced to form a beast hundreds of feet long and roared as if it were an enraged dragon. Under the frightened eyes of the armed men boarding the cargo truck, the flames engulfed the vehicle next to them inside. Boom! The truck exploded noisily. Pieces of broken metal flew skyward before falling to the ground once again as they left a trail of crimson fire wherever they passed, like meteors falling from outer space into the Earth's atmosphere. Everyone inside them died even before they could let out a single cry of pain. While mankind needs brave men, sometimes sacrifices are necessary. Bai Zemin thought aloud. Seeing the miserable fate of the more than 30 men in the truck, the other men inside several other vehicles who were preparing to attack hesitated. Many of them were unwilling to face such terrifying monsters. "Forget it." A police officer with some power sighed and his eyes glittered with weariness as he said, "Just let the soul evolvers take them on. What's the point of continuing to go when we'll just become meaningless cannon fodder anyway?" Soon, this message was transmitted over the radio to all the officers. Bai Zemin's group stopped receiving assaults from armed men. "Before I and my brother left the base, the number of grenades they had in arsenal was less than 50. Nangong Lingxin pointed out as she looked at the large village in the near distance. Probably during the previous week those 50 grenades were used to deal with mutated beasts with high defense or to open the path to a village so they could take the supplies inside. Even if they had grenades, they would only serve to increase the deaths on their side." Bai Zemin said coldly as he carefully rubbed the rejection ring on the middle finger of his left hand. If he had activated the special attached skill of this magic-grade treasure, everything would have been faster and easier. However, many would have died in the process, and this was what Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui wanted to avoid. Killing was easy, but both were aware that the biggest enemy was not the humans, it was the different races that were rising to power. To fight against the zombies, the wild beasts, and against the goblins, humanity needed to unite if it did not want to be annihilated. Of course, such a thing was incredibly difficult since humans were stubborn, greedy, and proud. Generally, no one was willing to be beneath anyone unless they really had no other choice. And for that, their lives would have to be on the line. That was precisely why Bai Zemin and the others knew that they would have to fight against their own race if they wanted to dominate. Because a soft confrontation would only lead to more harm than good. Considering this is a big city, I know it's normal for the accommodations to be better, but... Bai Zemin looked at the extremely luxurious villa in front of him and sighed, "This dude with the surname Kong sure lives the life. This villa is at least 3 times more luxurious than mine even from the outside. What's the use of having luxuries if you can't protect them?" Shangguan Bingshui scoffed and took a step forward. She drew her sword from the scabbard attached to her waist and with expert movements slashed several times. Bang! The courtyard gate that was made of steel was cut into hundreds of pieces before falling to the ground and raising a heavy cloud of dust. Before the dust cloud was completely accentuated, Shangguan Bingshui's face changed slightly and she jumped back while staring straight ahead. Swoosh! 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 Ice arrows, bolts of lightning, earth pikes, ice pikes, wind blades, and other types of elemental attacks rained down from the courtyard of Kong Rong's villa towards the group of 3. But that was not all. A soul evolver stepped forward and began muttering some strange words. 10 magic circles appeared before the soul evolver. The 10 magic circles lit up and 10 beasts appeared. There were grizzly bears, there were white wolves, there were bulls, there was even a 6-foot eagle. Roar! The summoned beasts howled at the sky before rushing forward. Nangong Lingxin's face turned as pale as a sheet. Although her energy barrier skill theoretically allowed her to parry any attack as long as she had enough mana, the problem was precisely that she didn't have that much mana to do something like that. Stopping dozens of elemental attacks along with several summoned beasts was something that was far beyond what the current Nangong Lingxin could do. Even Shangguan Bingshue's face changed slightly. However, she remained calm and raised several ice walls, one after another, in a matter of seconds. Bang, 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 bang. The elemental attacks hit the ice walls that Shangguan Bingshue had created. The first walls were shattered quite easily as she had crafted them in a hurry to buy some time. However, after losing about 6 lines of defense, the walls behind them suddenly became too hard and the elemental attacks began to have trouble continuing forward. The faces of the soul evolvers in charge of protecting Kongrong's villa turned ugly as their attacks were stopped by a single person. In the past, whenever they work as a team, no matter whether it was Soul Evolver, Wild Beast, or an army of armed men, everything collapsed. Continue attacking. I don't think that mage can hold off mana consumption for a long time. After shouts filled with shame and anger, another round of elemental attacks was conjured by the mages and flew out. The speed of the elemental attacks was much faster than the charging speed of the 10 summoned beasts, so even before the summoned beasts arrived in front of the ice walls, the second round of elemental attacks was crashing into the ice defense. Soon, the 10 summoned beasts arrived before the ice walls and began to attack. Some slashed with their claws, others simply crashed hard against the thick ice, while others began to leap over the courtyard walls to go around the walls blocking the entrance to reach those who were being protected behind. However, all these people were incredibly mistaken, because even though there were 1 or 2 first-order soul evolvers among the enemy mages and Shangguan Bingshue was also just a first-order existence like them, the difference between the soul power of the two sides was simply too great. Not only was the soul power within Shangguan Bingshue's soul significantly greater, but it was also much purer, brighter, and thicker. This was because she, unlike those who leveled up by fighting against enemies of equal or lower levels, she had been fighting and defeating first-order existences even when she was still an unclassified existence. Hence, Shangguan Bingshue's mana was not only a few times higher than that of the enemy mages. Even if one did not take into account that the enemies were only first-order existences whose jobs were normal and Shangguan Bingshue was a first-order existence with a unique job, just the difference in the quality and quantity of soul power was enough to seal the fate of the enemies. After spending around 100 mana points to build roughly 20 thick ice walls, Shangguan Bingshue's gaze grew cold and she held onto her sword tightly. Bai Zemin stood calmly, his expression unchanged. He looked up at the sky and noticed the summoned eagle flying in his direction. Ignoring the eagle, he looked at Shangguan Bingshue and said calmly, "If you want, then just go. There is no need to hold back against them." This was all she needed to hear. She activated her movement skill and jumped a dozen meters into the air. A massacre descended from the sky. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 260 Overwhelming Shangguan Bingshue. As Shangguan Bingshue rose into the sky like a graceful butterfly, Bai Zemin turned his attention back to the eagle. The eagle was really big, about 2 meters tall, and with a wingspan of approximately 6 meters. The beast had 2 legs covered by what appeared to be a metal coating as they glistened in the moonlight, and its approximately half-meter beak seemed to have the ability to pierce through everything. However, the most striking thing about the monster would be its eyes. The eagle's eyes were bright golden and seemed to have a certain level of intelligence. Bai Zemin did not know how summoning worked as he himself did not possess a similar skill. However, in his group, there were at least 3 people with skills that allowed them to summon beasts using mana as a catalyst to keep them in this world. Luo Ning was one of those people, and thanks to her, he had some knowledge about these kinds of beasts even if it wasn't too much. While summoners were powerful, this was only so because of their summoned beasts. Without them, these mages were nothing worth mentioning as their strength, stamina, agility, and health stats were generally not too high. After all, as summoners, the most important stats for them were magic and mana. Of course, reaching a summoner was not an easy task as they usually always kept a beast close to them to prevent surprise attacks. However, these summoners had a fatal weakness. Scree! The eagle screeched ominously and swooped downward in a dive. With its talons wide open as if to catch its prey, its golden eyes flashed coldly as it glared at Xietain. Xietain secretly smirked. He raised both arms with his hands stretched forward and met the summoned monster's attack head-on. Bang! The ground beneath Xietain cracked and Nangong Lingxin was forced back 2 steps due to the shockwave. However, when she looked forward she saw that Xietain had not even moved from his place, and while his hair fluttered as a result of the wind, a casual and indifferent smile adorned his face. Not bad. That attack from before was really wonderful. Xietain praised the eagle, which confused Nangong Lingxin. By using the falling strength and speed of your summoned beast, the power behind the impact improved by at least 5 times. How about joining me? I assure you that you won't lose your privileges once I control this entire base. The eagle's eyes flashed with fear. The beast seemed to receive some sort of command as it hastily flapped its wings and tried to retreat. However, Xietan's hands were like 2 hooks that were unwilling to let it go, as no matter how much it flapped, the beast failed to fly into the sky. The eagle's eyes flashed viciously, and noticing that it could not fly away, it suddenly swung its white head forward and pecked straight ahead with all its might, with the intention of turning its enemy's head into meat pulp. What a pity. Xietain sighed. His eyes flashed coldly, and in a swift movement, he released one of the beast's claws and turned his body 360 degrees as he leaned slightly to the side. The wind whistled past his face, and as he completed his turn, pointed his elbow outward. His armor was replete with thorns in the areas that could be used to attack, and the elbow area naturally had a rather sharp and large one. The eagle did not even react when Xietan's elbow struck it on the side of the neck. The beast opened its eyes wide and let out a pain-filled cry. Red blood and once white feathers fell to the ground. Just then, Xietain forcefully pulled one of the eagle's legs towards him as he jumped forward with his knee up. Bang! Critical hit. The thorn of the knee together with Xietan's full strength impacted hard against the eagle's chest. After a second pain-filled cry, the beast fell to the ground in a pool of blood before disappearing from this world forever. Inside the courtyard, the summoner, who was being protected by a red-colored tiger, suddenly opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. The brightness in his eyes weakened, and 2 summoned beasts attacking the ice walls were forcibly withdrawn from the battle. As a summoner, the mage could focus his senses on a beast and see or hear what that beast saw or heard. In short, this mage heard Xietan's invitation, but instead of retreating, he attacked him, which led to the immediate destruction of the eagle. If the above was an advantage, then one of the summoner's greatest disadvantages was that if one of their beasts was abruptly destroyed before the summoner severed the connection between the two, then he or she would also receive a huge backlash. Damn it. That summoner cursed with lingering fear. Quan Yang. Call your summoned beasts back. An anxiety-filled shout brought the summoner back to reality. When Quan Yang looked ahead, his face turned as pale as a sheet. Without knowing when, a beautiful immortal fairy-like woman had appeared inside the villa courtyard and was currently fighting against the soul evolvers, controlled by Kong Rong. The problem was that rather than calling this kind of confrontation a fight, perhaps it would be more correct to call it a one-sided massacre. Previously there were about 20 soul evolvers. However, in a few seconds, 5 of them had already been killed. The villa where Kong Rong resided was really big, and its courtyard even bigger. Shangguan Bing Shui moved nimbly all over the place, facing off against more than a dozen enemies with active skills with no sign of fear on her face. You should know that fighting soul evolvers was more dangerous than fighting mutated beasts. After all, the soul evolvers not only possessed active skills but also had their intelligence intact. Just as Quan Yang ordered his summoned beasts to stop attacking the ice walls and return, an ice arrow soared through the sky from a strange angle and pierced into his head. The summoned beasts roared, and a magic circle appeared under each one, being removed from this world as they lost the magic and mana support of the summoner. A man roared loudly and transformed into a werewolf over 6 feet tall. His muscles swelled to the point where his clothes could no longer contain them, breaking into pieces. With bloodshot eyes, the man who activated his first-order werewolf transformation skill jumped high into the sky, rising over 10 meters in an instant. Taking advantage of the force of the Earth's gravity, the man slashed downward ferociously towards Shangguan Bing Shui's head. Shangguan Bing Shui's gaze grew cold. She pointed forward and the earth bracelet on her wrist glowed for a moment as she created an ice wall behind her, successfully stopping several elemental attacks. A brown magic circle appeared on the ground and an instant later, a thick earth spike shot more than 2 meters high. The transformed man's expression did not change and he continued his attack. Bang! When the claw collided against the earth spike, the power of impact destroyed Shangguan Bingshue's attack. However, the man's right hand was also not unscathed as a 5-inch bloody hole appeared from which dark blood was constantly flowing out. The man, enraged by the pain he was feeling, stomped the ground and dashed forward at full speed. His agility after activating his werewolf transformation skill exceeded that of 15 humans before the apocalypse, so one could imagine how fast he was when he moved. Shangguan Bingshue activated Ice Maker, which was currently a first-order max-level skill, and formed a huge ice shield on the left side of her body. Bang! The transformed man's kick slammed into the ice shield and cracks began to spread all over it. However, before the man could feel pleased, he saw the silhouette of the woman in front of him suddenly become blurry for a moment. The next thing he saw was a flash of sharp light and then he felt a slight pain in his neck. Instantly followed, a red line appeared on his neck and blood slowly began to pour out. The brightness in the man's eyes dimmed, and a second later his head fell to the ground with a thud as it rolled several times before stopping. You have received the soul power of First Order Yin Kuan level 25. Agility plus 23, Magic plus 10, Mana plus 10. Shangguan Bingshue's eyes flashed with a hint of joy. She had already received a total of 61 stat points after killing all these soul evolvers. She was about to continue her massacre when she realized that the attacks on her had stopped. No. Even Lord Yin Kuan was killed. How can this be possible? So easily. Among the soul evolvers under Kong Rong's command, there were weak and strong. Those who were weak barely reached level 5 and the stronger ones like Wang Zedong already had the ability to crush a heavily armed troop. The man who had just been killed by Shangguan Bingshue in 2 moves was Yin Kuan, and he was one of the 5 most powerful soul evolvers that Kong Rong controlled. He was also the second most powerful person present, so all the soul evolvers despaired. The 14 or so survivors together did not have much confidence in defeating Yin Kuan. This was because the agility of Yin Kuan transformed into a werewolf had reached the point where he could dodge most of the attacks while slowly killing them. Therefore, seeing how the silver-haired woman had killed Yin Kuan with her blue sword in a single slash and how she was so fast that even he failed to react, they knew immediately that they would not be able to defeat her and would only be throwing themselves to their deaths if they continued like this. Chief Kong, please get Lord Shan to move. The soul evolvers looked towards the front door of the villa where 2 people were standing and began to shout anxiously as they kept their guard up against the dangerous woman before them. At this point, Kong Rong's face was incredibly ugly and all the fat on his body was shaking non-stop. He looked like a large meatball about to explode in anger as he looked at the scene before him. A third of the soul evolvers protecting his village had already been killed and the armed troops he was proud of were destroyed without them being able to do anything. In fact, Kong Rong did not know that most of his men did not dare to fight against Bai Zemin's group after seeing how overwhelmingly strong they were. Otherwise, Kong Rong might have spat blood and died on the spot. Shanli. Is this what you were going to report to me? Kong Rong asked calmly. However, the trembling of his body and the fire burning in his sunken eyes exposed that it was the calm before the storm. Shanli didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he nodded. Indeed. I sent that assassin woman to take care of the job. I thought that if she succeeded, then we would be getting rid of a future headache, and if she failed, then we would also be getting rid of a headache by eliminating a nuisance variant like her. But I didn't expect. Hi, Shanli sighed. But he didn't look frightened in the least as he watched the scene before him. In fact, his eyes had a playful gleam in them and he licked his lips as he looked at Shangguan Bingshue. She seemed to exude a strange aura brimming with a charm that shook his male hormones to the max, extremely strange but real. Kong Rong took a deep breath and forcibly calmed down. Seeing that Shanli was not nervous, his nerves also disappeared. After all, his strongest fighter was by his side.